Welcome to this edition of the Alumni Thought Leadership Podcast. As Australia awards alumni, we all know that the importance of acting as change agents in our workplaces, communities and countries. However, sometimes we are overwhelmed and we are unsure about how our unique individual influence can advance change. For example, in the gender equality and in the disability inclusion space. We are unsure how change happens and where to begin when everything looks overwhelming against us. So today's conversation is about change management and practical solutions to making change happen effectively. Welcome to our guest, Glenn Davis. Welcome, Glenn.
Thank you.
Glenn is a principal consultant at Respectful Relationships Consulting and a lecturer at the Chisholm Institute in Australia. Glenn's work is focused on the education of organizations and individuals in policy development, training and change management in the area of gender equality and ending violence against women and children. Glenn has worked extensively in development for DFAT-funded programs in the Southeast Asia and Pacific regions and within Australia. So let's kick off by asking, Glenn, what is change and how does change happen?
Yeah, and look, in the context that we're talking today, I think change, and more specifically positive change, is evolution, it's progression, and it's transformation. And we use that word a lot in the work that we do, in implementing gender equality and social inclusion, disability inclusion. Change always starts with an inventory of one's own knowledge and values. And I think that's an important thing that I've noticed in the work that I do, is that we're constantly asking people to examine themselves and say, how do you fit into this? And what are your thoughts and what's your knowledge on this? And is there things that you need to know? And so encouraging that fearless inventory of one's own knowledge and values is a starting point, I think. The other thing I find really interesting in the work that I've done is that change and leadership are so intrinsically linked, because change is leadership and leadership is change. Leadership itself is an act of change. And without getting too philosophical, I think it's wonderful to apply philosophy in the work. You know, it changes the state of nature. And, you know, my conception of leadership might not be where the mind goes naturally for many people. For many people, it goes to the great man theory and talking about appointed roles and span of control. I'd really like to focus on the conceptualizing leadership as an action, and meaning that anyone can do leadership. Anyone can implement change and take steps to transform a situation or a place. There's a guy who I've done a lot of reading on. His name's Randall Stutman, and he defines leadership as actions, messages, decisions, choices with the intent to make people and situations better. I keep that definition of leadership in my mind when I'm working with people, because, this is what we're about. We're about making things better. So I think change and leadership are intrinsically linked, and we look at them together in that sense. I don't know whether I answered your question, but I think that's probably good for a starting point.
And I think it's an important aspect, the making it better, because that's actually the change. But would you say there's small practical steps that an alum can take every day to start realizing that change?
I think if I was giving people advice about coming in and wanting to be change agents, I think the first step I would be looking around for is to see where is the authorizing environment. What's happening here in this place where I am, and it could be anywhere. It could be a workplace. It could be It could be a community. It could be a community service. It could be a sporting club. But I want to be knowing that where is there an authorising environment here? Are there people who want that change to happen here? And is there things that are are there pillars here at the moment that I can see that are authorising action in this regard? So I don't want to get too technical about it, but they're pretty plain in plain sight a lot of the time. There's constitutions and there's standard operating procedures and there's legislation. There's part of an organisation's value statement about where they want to be and how they treat people. And I think these are all signposts for people if we're looking to implement change and to be a change agent. We want to know about what's going on existing in that organisation. And I think that's a really good place to start. I think looking around for other like-minded people who are interested in the work, I think that's important as well. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, because those coalitions of groups of people and community of practice groups and that's really important as well. But I think leadership in an organisation is really important as well. And I suppose what we should be doing is consulting with them about where they sit and what they want in regard to this. We should have some good base knowledge about a theory of change. So knowing what gender equality, social inclusion, disability inclusion, what that can do for the organisation, and whether there are advantages for the organisation in embracing these values and embracing this policy, and if there is, making the case. So tomorrow I'm doing a workshop with alumni, and we're going to do role play about how do we have a conversation with the CEO? How do we talk to the CEO and make the case as to why this is important and why he or she would allocate resources to this important policy initiative? And I think that's a good question to ask ourselves about, do we know our topic? Do we know the work? And do we know the case? Can we make the case to people? And that's what I was talking about earlier with that moral inventory, or the fierce examination of oneself in regard to where we stand with this. Unless we know what we know about the topic, we can't encourage movement or change from other people as well. So I think those conversations with leaders are very important, because they also provide the authorising environment. Whatever's come before them that sits in policy, that's great. But who are the leaders of the organisation now that are mobilising this policy or have an appetite for this policy? So it's good for us to do an investigation around and see who's around and what is the appetite for this work. I want to circle back to what I said about finding others who want to be part of this, because it's not something you can do alone, and the work it's not conducive to people being by themselves. And creating work groups, creating spaces where people can come in and assist and be part of that is really important as well. So I would want to be, as well as doing the diagnostics, working collaboratively with other people. And the advantage of working with other people, of course, is we get different skills and different perspectives. We get different demographics of people and ages and sexes and status as well. We get different ideas. That diverse representation can be a an antidote to groupthink, which sometimes we can get very bogged down in thinking that we're heading in the right path, and an outsider coming in can really help us that way. It helps us share the load. So, there's so much to do. We need to allocate tasks to people and use the strengths of people to reach out into different spaces. The people who are part of these work groups they have a stake in this as well. So they become champions as well. We've got to identify more allies and people who might be doing similar work to what we're doing, so that we can connect with them and find common ground where there could be some overlap. But if we're getting other people to come in from other marginalised groups or other groups that we can work with and partner with. I know in my work in Fiji, there was a very strong women's sector there, and the Fiji Women's Crisis Centre were just an amazing group of people. We had other UN agencies who were working in the space as well. There were UN Women and UNDP, and as well as government, and we had them together in partnership working on JETSI work, and they had we were able to lever off resources from lots of different people and working in collaboration with them. We get different views, voice and perspective by involving lots of people in groups, and that's also a really important starting point after we're assessing the authorising environment, we're connecting with leaders, we're making the case, and then working collaboratively and forming these groups.
Important in the alumni context, because in Australia, with Australia Awards Africa, we have associations, we have, communities of practice, we've got Women in Leadership Network chapters across the continent. So coalitions and networks are very important. My next question is around tools and frameworks. Do you know of any tools and frameworks that could help individuals to champion social change effectively?
Yeah, I enjoy looking at the work that's been done in Australia, and I certainly have used some great work that Our Watch Australia has produced. They have a workplace equality and respect program, and I've worked with providers and used that framework to start looking at their policies and processes and doing some evaluations of an organisation I work with, and I had the support of the leadership to do that, and I think it's a very good program. It provides a lot of templates that you can roll out. So if you're doing an assessment of a workplace's capacity and tolerance to sexual harassment, there's surveys. If we're looking at sex disaggregated data in relation to leadership, we can look at those things. We can look at gaps, pay rate gaps. All of those are included in that Our Watch Australia Workplace Equality and Respect program. And there's been other reviews that have been done in Australia historically. Kate Jenkins did a review, the Sex Discrimination Commissioner did a review of the Australian Parliament. I love that. It was a really well done review, but they follow the same template. They follow the same examination of what's happening, key informant interviews, examining policy, reviewing whether that policy is adequate, and then asking the workforce, asking people that are in organisations as to what their perceptions are and how they're feeling. There's another network called the Champions of Change Network, and they were set up quite some years ago now, a part of groups of CEOs in mining companies, in other sectors as well, to look at the issue of women's leadership and representation of women in their organisation. And they've certainly got some great tools and templates and great success stories as well about how they reviewed and making this a keystone issue in an organisation. So when you're wanting to make this happen, it's I suppose I go back to when I was doing my master's. The lecturer was trying to explain to us about when you implement change, what do you want it to look like? And at the front of the classroom, he had this big pitcher of water, and he just had a cup of milk that he poured into the pitcher of water. And of course, everyone there is looking at this pitcher of water, and it's changing colour. It's going from clear to quite opaque, with the milk just coming into every part of the pitcher of water. And he asked us what do you think of what you've just seen? And he said, well, the milk went in and it changed what the pitcher of water looked like. It changed everything within there. And he said, is there anything missing? Is there any place where this hasn't gone into? And we said, no, it's gone everywhere. And he said, that's a concept of fractal change. And he said, fractal change is a mining term, actually, a geological term. And it means it's seeped into every nook and cranny, into every space. And if we're looking at implementing change successfully, I think for me, that metaphor's really stayed with me over the years to say, how can I influence it? How can this be part of our culture and our T-shirt that we pull on every day? How can this be part of everything we do? And certainly the best implementers of change that I've worked with, and there's been so many that I admire. Christine Nixon was a chief commissioner in the police force that I worked in for 30 years and implemented the most spectacular change management strategy. And this was certainly something that she did. And everything that we did, we had to report on what was the impact on our people. It was just a simple thing that whether it was planning to do a sporting event at the cricket, or it was planning to execute a drug warrant on a house, or whether it was a crowd control situation. How is this going to affect our people? What's the impact on our people? Are we looking at the well-being of our people? And with that simple focus, we were able to shape, the organisation was able to shape what their values were and what they thought about their people into every space that every action that we did, every intervention that we worked on. I'm reading a book at the moment about a guy who was the CEO of Alcoa named Paul O'Neill, and he had a similar approach. And when I read it, I thought that's very similar to what Christine Nixon was looking at. And when he came in and was elected, when he was appointed as CEO, he said to the shareholders, I'm going to make something really important statement that I want this organisation to focus on, and that's the safety of our people. And of course, the share price went down because all the shareholders went, "Oh my goodness, what is this guy talking about? He must have lost his mind, because this isn't the way that CEOs talk to people." But when Alcoa started to focus on the safety of their people, the well-being of their people, there were so many strands that went out into all aspects of the organisation. They became better at what they did. They became safer at what they did. They cared for their people. They had policies around looking after their people. They made sure that their people weren't going to be killed. And the worker safety and the incidence of accidents and incidents of worker injury went down to zero. And of course, the shareholder price went through the ceiling, and they've been one of the most successful companies. And I think this is what I mean by gender equality and social inclusion. If we focus on that as being our keystone issue, there's no limits to what change that we can do. But it's about championing the cause, finding the leaders, establishing groups, doing an inventory on our own thoughts and our own skills and our own knowledge, and then having a plan. And the plan's the next step, I suppose, that we need to be able to implement that.
Do you think technology and social media, what role can that play to amplify the alumni voices for inclusion and change?
Oh, that's a great question, and wow, you probably in relation to my knowledge of social media, I'm not really au fait with a lot of the technicality of it, but I see the impact throughout the world, and I see that the attention market now is something that's really important. It's the way people communicate. When I first started in this business, I thought one of the most important people you could partner with is to have a good marketing and a communications person with you. I think they are golden in that sense, and they might not know about the intricacies of the work that we do. They might not know about the theory of change, but when you work with them and explain that to them, they can definitely amplify the connection, the voice, the exposure of the work that we're doing. And I think I was speaking to your group the other day, DC, that if we've got something that we see and notice at the corner of our eye, then we can easily dismiss it. If we see it again, well, okay, that's a bit of a coincidence. We've seen something twice. But once we start seeing things everywhere, once we start seeing the messages about gender equality and social inclusion, about respect, about respectful relationships, about the keystone issues that we are putting in this theme that we're working with, and it's in our faces all the time, and it's part of our organisation, it's really hard to ignore. So I think social media can really play an important part to get messages across, to galvanise people in groups. I also wanted to say something about awareness raising, because I've talked to a lot of students about this, and there seems to be some confusion about what is awareness raising something that is going to implement change. And I've got a fairly strong view about that, because it's all really lovely to have 100,000 people at the Melbourne Cricket Ground with their phones holding it up and it's spelling out end violence against women. And it's definitely got a wow factor to it when you have so many people. But this is this is not an implementing strategy. This is raising awareness. This is looking at maybe starting an interest. This is the thing at the corner of our eyes that we might initially see. It doesn't leave an artifact. And like a fireworks display, it can go away very quickly. And once it's gone and night falls and the darkness is still there, people will forget about it very quickly. I heard someone talk the other day about, speeches and awareness raising are like sunburn. You feel the warmth for a couple of days and then it goes away. Probably in this day and age, not a lot of people feel sunburn, but you can still see the fireworks. And we're approaching the 16 days of international activism, and I think that's great. For elimination of violence against women, we need to have the T-shirts and we need to have people raising their voices and marching and all of that. But unless it's attached to a policy agenda, unless we're moving forward and it's starting to go into something else, and it's part of a range of strategies that we're using to produce really rock-solid policy, or that movement is happening, then we've got to take it for what it is. We've got to look at the awareness raising as it is. It's nice to look at, but it's not causing, in of itself, it's not going to change anything at all.
I couldn't agree with you more there. Often, when I speak to alumni with small grants and so forth, there's always the awareness, creation in there. But then I go, first of all, how do you even know that you are aware, or how do you measure that awareness that you've created? And then what then? What afterwards? And I think that what you mentioned there is very important. What are the practical changes or the practical steps and the policies that's in place? That brings me to another question, and that's about how do you define success when the change is more cultural, when it's about attitudes and perceptions rather than structural change or structural issues that needed to be changed?
I think, look, structural change is really important because it influences in so many different sites. I was saying earlier, we can have changes in the home and changes in community, changes in schools. We can change the policies and how people are trained. We can have policies that recruit more people and measure representation of how many people do we now have in leadership, and we can examine pay rates, and we can really see some change happening there, and if we've improved that from our first assessments. But attitudes and beliefs are really important, and I think that really gets to the nub of whether we're being successful. And recently we've had something in Australia where there's been some talk about, well, the numbers of women being murdered by a former partner hasn't gone down. In fact, we have a woman murdered every 8 to 9 days in Australia by a partner or a former partner. And that's far too many, absolutely. But people are saying we've poured all this money into prevention of violence against women. We're working in organisations. We have gender equality policies. We're looking at gender equality as being the key issue that we need to address, and yet we haven't seen this happening, the lowering of those rates. And so I think we need to look at this other measure of attitudes and beliefs. And we've got some great measures in Australia that I quite like and I go to quite regularly. One is our National Community Attitudes Survey. And that for me, is a valuable resource to take. It takes the temperature of the community in regard to their tolerance or intolerance to violence against women and gender inequality issues. So I think that's a really great measure and a really a big cohort of people interviewed about that. And the other one is the Man Box, and that's another one that is relating to men and boys and their attitudes and beliefs around the pressures that men have placed on them and have historically been placed on them for a long time about how they perform their masculinity. So we know that men who are agreeing with those pressures or seeing those pressures as something that's legitimate, very firm gender stereotypes about control, and where use of violence is somehow justified, that they're more likely to be in the cohort of people who are using violence and gender-based violence. And so when we have a rejection of those man box pressures, we find that men's health improves. They're less likely to abuse alcohol and drugs. They're far less likely to experience to suicide. They have much more healthy relationships. They are more predisposed to being better fathers. There's a whole range of health impacts for men. And when I read those types of surveys that are specifically looking at attitudes and beliefs, we can see the changes happening. And when they become a visible a publication, and we're promoting those as a prevention strategy, the impact can have certainly have a flow-on effect. And when I'm teaching students, I certainly have got some great feedback from the Man Box and the NCAS data as well, that people feel as if there has been some progress over time. The other data that's important is our ABS data that comes through, and there's a lot of attitudinal questions that are part of that as well. We can get some really accurate measures on and taking the temperature of how gender equality is going. So they're the types of things that I look at, but I think it's to raise the issue about this structural changes that we make, and has it translated to changes in attitudes and beliefs, or attitudes and perceptions? Because having attitudes and perceptions that align with tolerance for violence actually means that we're going to see an upkick in that, an uptake in that. So, yeah, I think it's a good point to make.
Thanks, Glenn. The other thing that's quite important in our alumni context in Africa is barriers and resistance in environments that are traditional and conservative. Do you have any ideas on overcoming those?
The first thing I'd like to say, and I do a lot of work with in men's groups and working with men who have used domestic violence in their families. So I really get to dive into the nitty-gritty, and resistance is definitely a part of that work, and being able to address that resistance. What I would say to alumni that encounter resistance, because resistance is a natural part of change. There is always going to be some pushback in different environments that we work. Culture and religion are often get brought up as something that is as a justification for keeping things the same and not engaging in a change process. And what I like to do is ask lots of questions about that. Tell me something about your culture that you really enjoy. Tell me the good things about your culture. Tell me about your traditions, and get to know people. Because the work that we do is about relationships and about building relationships with people. And we can't come at it I believe we can't come at it from an oppositional perspective. We always have to be looking at creating conversation and relationships with people if we're relying on them to engender change as well. So I sit on the outside, and where I've been into working in different countries, I'm certainly an outsider, and I certainly don't have a unique and detailed understanding of people's culture, but I can certainly be curious about it. I can certainly be open to listening about what they understand their culture to be, and then unpack that a little bit with them, and tell me about whether you think your culture's changed over time. Tell me about whether there are impacts in society or history where gender roles have changed over time. And after a while, people begin to realise that culture is not a fixed thing, that it is very responsive to what's happening in the world and happening around. And we only need to look at Cyclone Winston in Fiji when I was working there in 2017 or 18, the impact that had on the community, and how much change happened in gender roles there, where women became the builders of houses and the providers for the family, and men were quite devastated by what occurred, and were quite so scarred that they were almost in a catatonic state. And I'm generalising, but these were the assessments we were doing at the time, and we saw quite different gender roles coming to the fore. I mean, that's one example, but we've had world wars where women have gone to work in factories, and when the men went off to war, they took on those very different roles as well. And so culture probably isn't fixed, and it can change, and it can change for the better as well. So for people who are sometimes frightened of change and putting up that resistance, often a conversation can help with that. Knowing that also we work with a movable middle. We're not working with people that are really, really fixed and not going to come to the party on it. Those people are always going to be there. We've got people that go, oh, yeah, look, it's interesting, I'm not too sure. And we've got our people on this side, and we know that they're our allies and they're going to be working with us. But we've got people in the middle, and I think knowing ourselves and knowing our work, knowing the theory of change, and knowing the work, and being inquisitive and open to listening to people can often break down some of those barriers as well. I think it's an invitational approach is much better than force. Going back to my policing days and the work of Christine Nixon, amazing manager and leader, she was able to create an environment that incentivized you wanting to be part of the change. And it was never said that if you're not on board, then you're not on board, you're not part of this. But everyone knew if you wanted to be a part of this movement and a part of a future of an organisation, then it was in our best interest to find out more about this. I just wanted to say something else, DC, about I was reflecting on being able to influence and how there may be people that are resistant and don't know about how to go about this work, or feel insecure because they don't have the knowledge. And I think that's the job of a change agent as well. And our alumni can influence in this space. I went to Fiji as a ministerial advisor to the Fiji Ministry of Women, Children and Poverty Alleviation, and they were really good at children and poverty alleviation, but they weren't really focused on women and gender equality. So women's leadership and ending violence against women, there was certainly room for improvement. We had a policy, we had a budget, we had an annual action plan, but not a great deal on gender equality and ending violence against women. And I think this was a challenge. And so in discussing with my manager, who was definitely on the right of the movable middle, she was on board with that. And she had a cohort of people that were and connections in the community that were fantastic. We set about how we were going to provide more information to our minister about this being really a really important issue, identifying men's violence as a developmental issue for the country that was part of the policy that wasn't being actioned. One of my tasks was I had to write speeches for the minister, and I even wrote one for the Prime Minister to deliver at the UN. It's a bit of a drill in the crowd. I'm really proud of that. But we encouraged public commentary and debate. We got our male advocates to write letters to the newspaper. We included materials in our education and our community of practice meetings with our JETSI focal points. And we designed and communicated materials. We got experts into the communities and forums with local leaders to speak about ending violence against women. And I remember writing pages and pages of background information in answer to questions for the minister, because she was answering questions in Parliament about the perceptions of things that were going on. So a 3-minute question in Parliament is usually delivered pretty fast, at a pretty fast pace, about a minute a page. And I remember writing, 6 or 7 pages for her that she'd read. Of course, she read everything before she went to Parliament. And when I first started writing things for her, she would scribble all over it, cross outs everywhere. But as we kept working and kept providing her with more and more information, the edits become less and less. And her advocacy for this issue with more knowledge and more information was just outstanding, and she became one of the most amazing, strong, powerful leaders in Fiji for ending violence against women. She was competent. She encouraged the public space. She had massive credibility. It was just a case that I feel very proud of, that it was a great team effort and people coming together and having a strategy to provide more information to people who were leaders, engendered them with as change makers as well. So I just thought I'd mention that one.
Thanks, Glenn. I think we can speak about this forever, but in conclusions, let me just ask, are there any other lessons that you've learned from your experience that you think others could apply?
I had mentioned plenty, but the one thing I would say, and I am a huge advocate for, we need men on board with this. Men hold positions of power. And they have, and here's us two blokes talking about this. We don't even have a woman in the room, but I think getting to men and providing them with information is really important as well. One of the work in PNG that I did, one of our activities was to get 30 leaders from across government departments, police, magistrates, get them in the room. And have a facilitated male advocacy course that went for 5 days. It was we used a women's service from Fiji who facilitated the whole session. It was at the foothills of the Kokoda Track, which is a really historical wartime symbol, and the men enjoyed it. We had insight. We worked on giving them some insights into themselves as men, how they perform their masculinity, the impacts on that and themselves and their family. And it was such an important strategy. From that, the product was we had a group of men who became agents and supporters, sponsors, spokespersons. They were shepherding activities. They were entrepreneurial in themselves, and they knew the value of standing up beside women in this struggle for gender equality, and they became great change agents. So my advice to people working in this space, don't ignore men who want to be a part of this. They might not have the knowledge, but they can be great allies, and we need men on board with this as well.
I think that's a powerful message there. Glenn, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for helping us. Thank you for sharing your knowledge about this. And to our listeners, thank you.
Thank you for having me, DC.
To our listeners, thank you very much for listening today. And you're welcome to give us your feedback at alumni@australiaawardsafrica.org. So until next time, goodbye.